Everybody, and welcome to True Crime with the Sarge. I got a great guest today, Mary Murphy, who's a reporter from WPIX in New York. She's been a New York City legend on the news. She'll be joining us in a few minutes. She's in the green room right now. And just wanted to go through a couple of quick things. If you're watching this live on YouTube and Kick, thank you very much. If this is the replay crew, I appreciate you guys also. Next Friday, coming up on the 22nd, I will be having a members only chat. That's what we'll be doing that for all our channel members here. So if you're a channel member, you're going to have a special show for you at the end of the week coming up. All right, guys, without any further ado, we're going to bring Mary back in. Mary, welcome
Hello.
to the show.
Hi,
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Sergeant, for having me.
Good. It's good to see you again. I know we've done a lot of different news segments over the years, but you have gotten yourself into a pretty neat niche, so to speak. You know, we got a couple of shows, but before we get into that, is reporting something that you always wanted to do? Like, you know, do this kind of live stuff? Or how did you get involved with it?
I often say that my mother gave me the idea. My mom is also named Mary Murphy. She's from County Galway, Ireland. And when I was about 13 years old, we were watching Channel 7 Eyewitness News. Roseanne Scammerdella was the nice Italian-American girl from Brooklyn. And at that time, we were having problems with inflation, just like we are now. And she was talking about grocery prices and walking through the supermarket. And my mother turned to me and said, "You can do that." And I think she knew that I liked to communicate. And also I discovered at a pretty young age that I had an affinity for writing. So I was able to tell stories fairly easily. And I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, well, and we're glad that you did it because it's something that is you've pretty much been you know, I'm not going to ask how many years because we don't want to do that.
I don't care.
Okay. All right. How many years have you been doing this?
I just marked 40 years on New York television back in September, on September 17th. So it was 1983 when I first stood in front of a TV camera, and I was behind the scenes for 2 years before that.
Wow, 40 years. And you've seen a lot of stuff, right? We're going to get into some of that in a little bit. But before we do so you have actually two kinds of segments that we want to discuss. And all these shows are actually in the show notes, including Mary's Facebook page, Mary Murphy Mystery. So you have two shows. You have The Missing and you have the Mary Murphy Mysteries. Now, this has been going on for quite a while now. You've been doing this for a couple of years. Tell us a little bit about these segments. Like, how did they all come about?
First, I'll tell you about The Missing, since that is more recent. So I know many of the viewers remember the Gabby Petito case, which really received national and international attention. Very tragic story of the girl going cross country with her boyfriend, and there was domestic violence involved, and she was later found dead out west. And around that time, there was a lot of interest in Gabby's case. But some people among our viewership, they were concerned that people that go missing in the Black and brown communities of New York and New Jersey and the tri-state, that they weren't getting a lot of attention. So my news director, Nicole Tindilia, she emailed me on a Sunday and she said, "I would like you to go into some missing person stories, and how do these pieces get chosen? How do these cases get chosen?" So I said, we really should follow this, because I know that the communities out there are upset. They want more attention for their cases. So we started doing it, and it really resonated with the audience. We were averaging in the beginning about 2 stories a week. And if I can't do a TV story, I put it on the web. And a lot of times the missing stories are number one. People really care about these cases.
And they should, right? I mean, there's so many that we have, you know, not only just New York City, but it's an epidemic all in itself with the amount of missing people that go and we can never find again.
I looked this up. About 600,000 people go missing every year, according to NamUs, which is the National Missing and Unidentified Persons Database. Mm-hmm. Most of them show up, but there are about 4,400 people who die and are recovered each year that are not identified. That's one end of the spectrum. But then you have all these other people that go missing, and a lot of them are young. And the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children told me when I first started doing the stories that 92% of the runaways among the younger population are considered endangered runaways. You know, so many problems at home, so many problems going to school, being bullied, being lured on Snapchat, on Instagram, and with social media. So we've had to look at deeper social issues when we've been reporting on some of these people that go missing.
Yeah, no, and there's a lot of different aspects about what's actually happening, including the reporting, including, and I'm talking about reporting from the families, not so much from the media, but we need to get the media aspect of it too. What's, as you're getting further in this and you're now interviewing families and you're getting there trying to get them the help that they need, what's their number one complaint that you hear from families about, I guess, about law enforcement in general, about the police?
The number one complaint is they're not being heard. Part of the problem is if someone is over the age of 18, they're considered an adult. And so the police have a lot of cases they're juggling. And so sometimes they can't prioritize one missing person case over another. And there are a lot of people that go missing. But the number one complaint I hear is I'm not getting the feedback. I'm not getting my phone calls answered. And I'm not blaming the police for that, but the families get very frustrated. And I think that's where we came in and helped a lot, because not only the power of traditional media, but the power of social media. So many of our cases that we've reported had some successful results, because once it went on the web for pix11.com, it kind of exploded, and then it would go on Facebook and Instagram and other platforms. And I really feel that's where, there have been some changes in how these cases get looked at.
And one of the things that I've been pushing for family members too, right? Specifically, social media has played a big role in this, and I don't think anything's ever going to supplant the traditional media, because that is still a huge, aspect of getting the story out there. But as far as social media is concerned, do you think it's been a positive, so to speak, from any families, or it kind of is a double-edged sword? Do you think?
It is a little bit of a double-edged sword, and the families have to be careful, because sometimes when someone goes missing and they put out a poster that is handmade, it's not from the police department, they will put private numbers on these posters. And part of the problem there is if someone is a scammer or wants to take advantage of the family, they'll call up and say, oh, I saw a sighting.
Good point.
Or if you send me $500, I'll tell you where he or she is. So you have to be very careful with that. But I do find that there have been pages that have cropped up now all over the country, and especially here in New York. Two that I would shout out is Missing People of NYC, Lorraine Ellis. She's one of the administrators. She does a great job. And then they have the Missing People of Long Island. So I think a lot of good has been done on those pages.
Yeah, there's been a lot of advocacy for missing persons, and also for, in cold cases, which we're going to get to in a minute when we talk about your Mary Murphy mysteries. But just from the missing person standpoint, like you said, there's a lot of people that, do come back home, right? Mostly kids, right? I mean, what's the age group do you see as the most vulnerable as you've been doing this?
Well, the most vulnerable in terms of being lured, the most
or just about anything, yeah.
Girls that are 12, 13, 14 years old. There are so many of them that are going online without their parents knowing about it. Even times when the parents have put in certain restrictions, somehow these young people still find a way to communicate, a lot of times with men, and the men sometimes pretend that they're younger than they are, and then they arrange a meeting, and then before you know it, the girl isn't coming home. And unfortunately, a lot of them are being sexually trafficked. So it's really a vicious cycle. So I do find that when I see the missing persons reports that come in from the NYPD, from the Nassau and Suffolk Police here in New York, I find that a lot of them are missing girls and also boys. And I always get worried when they're 12 or 13 years old. I feel like they're being recruited for gangs or something bad like that. I just get very worried, because I know when young people are recruited for these kinds of things, it's because they're younger, and because if they get caught or get into trouble or they're caught with drugs, that the penalties may not be as great as if the person was an adult. So it's very concerning.
Right, and we can get into a discussion about raise the age on another day, but I think that has a lot to do with some of the increase in crime that we've seen with the juveniles. But when it comes to missing persons, I always tell families that the second you find that somebody is missing, report it. Right, don't hesitate, especially when it comes to the kids, because that delay can actually be a big problem for the law enforcement aspect down the road.
Yeah, the sooner the better. Sometimes they're is confusion because the parents will go to the precinct where the family lives, and then they're told, oh, you have to wait a certain number of hours, or they may go to where the child was last seen, which could be in a different borough of New York City, and then they'll hear, well, you have to report them missing from where you live. So sometimes there is a little bit of a runaround.
Yeah, and there is, for everybody listening now, there is no waiting period for when you can report somebody missing. It's the second you have, especially a child, anybody under the age of 18 when they're missing, don't wait. That 48 hours is not something that it's a procedure, and every minute counts, and it's important.
Keep making phone calls, write emails, contact the media. Just keep plugging away.
Yep. And we're going to get into that about how we contact it. Well, you know what? Since you brought it up, let's talk about that. As a reporter and a TV news reporter, how do you want to be approached by family members, right? And what are some of the suggestions that you could give? Because we know the traditional media is still an important aspect to get the story out there.
Well, I have found in recent years some of the most important tips that I've received have been on social media like Facebook or Instagram. And I've received tips even on cold cases. There was a story from 2004, which really received no attention. A young woman, Sharabia Thomas, she disappeared on her way to school. Beautiful girl from Brooklyn. She was 17, and her body was found 2 days later in a laundry bag in an alley. And the case was cold for probably close to 20 years. And I received a tip on Facebook from a woman who said she was my neighbor, and there's so much attention on this other case that you're covering. Why don't you look at her case? So I told the cold case squad about it. They decided to get the evidence kit. When they put the DNA back into the system, it connected to a guy who was getting out of prison in Florida for robbery, who actually had lived on Gates Avenue in Brooklyn, the same street where this young woman disappeared on her way to school. She lived 2 blocks away from him. His name was Kwahuru Govan. And so they were able to arrest him for the murder of Sharabia Thomas. And then they connected him to another cold case, Rashawn Brazel, which received a lot of attention. That was a young man who disappeared on Valentine's Day in the mid-2000s. And in his case, he was dismembered. And the mother was on America's Most Wanted several times. But it was only after Sharabia Thomas's killer was arrested that they connected this man to Rashawn Brazel's murder. The mother was upset recently, Rashawn's mother, when the DA decided not to do his trial. The guy's already in prison for life on Sharabia Thomas's case, so they're not going to do a murder trial involving her son.
Wow, that's a heavy case. So we have Brooklyn Pesola here. Oh my God, my mom's a huge Mary Murphy fan because of the Leandra Guzman case. See that? You got all kinds of fans.
Oh, that's the Junior case. That was probably the biggest case that I've covered in the last 20 years in terms of the response from the public.
Yep. And there's another question from Karen about Amber Alerts. Like there's such a, we've had a couple of Long Island cases, or at least one Long Island case, right, where the Amber Alerts didn't go off too well, and I think the child was found dead in Virginia, and it was so Amber Alerts are good, but you know what, law enforcement needs to do some more. You need to do a better job with those things.
Yeah, and then they also have the silver alerts, or the people that are vulnerable, that have mental illness like schizophrenia, or some of them are maybe adults, but they're very vulnerable, and so those alerts need to go out.
Yes, no. So I mean, we know that, like I said, family can do some things, but like you brought up a good point, it could also be a double-edged sword for them. What kind of suggestions would you give to family members as they're going through the process? Because it's something that I hear a lot of complaints about from family members, that nobody really talks to them about things. But from the media standpoint, what are some of those things that you can tell the family?
Well, I would tell them that they have to go public in as many ways as possible if they want to have some success in realizing an outcome. So obviously start with law enforcement, start with the police. I had a family recently very upset because, and this story we did on pix11.com, and we did a television story. This man, Terrence Smith, he had gone to Virginia on Amtrak to see a high school friend, a female friend. And he went at the end of October. He was supposed to come back October 30th. never came back. And the family got in touch with the female friend. And it turned out that his cell phone was connected to his mother's cell phone. So they were able to go into the system and they saw that Terrence Smith's bank account was cleaned out within a day or so of him getting to Virginia. And they found out that he was in touch with this woman there, Lola. And it turned out that there were 3 different versions of what happened to him. But unfortunately, he was found dead in the woods, not far from Lola's house. And the police there, the sheriff's office, they've been working on this since the end of October. But now the family asked me recently, last night, if I knew anyone in the FBI, because we're talking about interstate stuff going on here. There has been no arrest. And, they just buried him yesterday. So I think you have to go to as many people as you can. You have to be very proactive, go to the police, go to law enforcement, obviously, but use the media too. Use these community pages on Facebook. There are so many missing persons cases.
Yes, and like I said, and if you're going to reach out to people on social media, just do your due diligence, do your homework, make sure they have a good reputation. That's about the only advice that I want to put on for certain people, because there's a lot of things happen on this true crime stuff on the internet that I'm not happy with, and a lot of other people aren't either. It's a lot of people do this for exploitation, and you have to be real careful of that.
Yeah.
So you've covered lots of huge trials. Like, so today, for those that don't know, is a big mob history day. December 15th, 1985, right? So it happens like in another hour or so, right? Where I think it was like 4 or 5 o'clock.
Yes, rush hour, yeah. Christmas shopping on 46th Street off 3rd Avenue, Sparks Steakhouse.
Yep. So for those that don't know, so you were actually there, right?
Yes, I was a young reporter. This was 1985, so I'd only been doing this 2 years and only full-time about a year. And so I was sent over. We were only 4 blocks away at WPIX. We're on 42nd Street. So I ran over there and I saw the 2 bodies on the street with the tarp over them. Paul Castellano was the godfather, the head of the Gambino crime family, which was the largest crime family at the time in the United States. And then his driver, who was also one of the lower ranking bosses in that family, Tommy Bellotti, he was dead on the street because he was getting out of the driver's side when these 3 gunmen came up in tan trench coats and they were wearing like Cossack hats and they got away. I think the escape route was 2nd Avenue in Manhattan. But this was all featured in the Get Gotti series on Netflix. And, it came out during the trial. We didn't know initially. But John Gotti and his underboss, Sammy Bolgravano, at that time, neither of them were bosses. They were capos. But John Gotti was sitting there in a car on 3rd Avenue with Sammy Bull watching this go down. And very soon after, he was made the boss of the Gambino family.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that they actually, people say, well, why didn't they just kill him? He actually did the mob a favor because the FBI had bugged Castellano's house. And that would have been bad to have a boss arrested, and that would have been a big issue. But there's a part of New York City crime history, right? And there you are at the scene. It's actually kind of, when you think about it. So I know you were in the new Netflix series too, correct?
Yeah, they interviewed me a year and a half ago. It took a long time to put it together. It was very well produced by the production company. The stars of the series are really the mobsters that are featured, and also the FBI agents and the detectives that worked with the New York State Organized Crime Squad. They did all the wiretapping and heard all the conversations. So they're the stars, but I did manage to make it into all 3 parts. So I enjoyed being part of it because I covered a lot of John Gotti. When he was first made the boss, he had a case in Queens with the refrigerator repairman who all of a sudden forgot he forgot that this was the guy who allegedly assaulted him. Once he heard he was the godfather, he didn't want to pursue the case. And then I covered the final trial in its entirety. The 3rd trial, which involved the wiretaps from New York State, when there was a union boss, the carpenters union. Apparently, there was a shooting and he was hit a few times. And they said John Gotti ordered it. Bust him up was heard on the wiretap. But he was acquitted in that case. And I chased him during the trial as he got into a car. And I said, Mr. Gotti, why won't you wear your headphones? And he said, I like Julio Iglesias, meaning he liked to listen to the singer. He didn't want to listen to the government's wiretaps. he was the only one in the courtroom who wasn't wearing the headphones. So so then after he went to prison, I still covered organized crime. And in the early 2000s, he died 10 years after he went to prison. So I was doing a live shot outside his house in Howard Beach, and I covered his funeral, which was something to behold. There were helicopters out getting aerial shots of the hearse going along 101st Avenue, which was where his social club was in Queens. And then there was another club in Manhattan. But Queens was really where he made his bones and, where he became initially known. So, those memories are something that stay with me of covering that.
Yeah, the irony is that his social club there in Ozone Park is now it's a pet supply company or something like that.
At one point it was an ice cream parlor, but I think it's changed hands a couple of times.
Yeah, so I mean, talk about how much New York City has changed, specifically out there. The diner is gone and everything else that they used to hang out on the Belt Parkway by the LaGuardia.
Yes.
The Skyway Diner, right? I think it was Skyway.
Yes, they used that diner in Goodfellas, the movie, that famous mob movie Scorsese did. He was the director.
Yep, there's another little New York City tidbit history about that. That's the same diner that you said that Gotti and his crew used to use to talk and do their thing. And then, so now we have another huge trial coming up that you've been on the ground. Everyone knows which one we're going to talk about next, but Rex Heuermann and the Long Island serial killer. Unfortunately, today, right, Commissioner Rodney Harrison officially separated from the department.
Yes.
Do you have any concerns about who takes over, or you hear anything about who might take over?
No, I mean, Ed Remain is the new county executive. I believe he's a Republican. And so a lot of times when someone comes into power after an election, they hire people they know or they feel comfortable with. So I have no idea who he's going to name as the police commissioner. I wasn't surprised that Commissioner Harrison left. I mean, he came into office in Suffolk County immediately after leaving the NYPD. He spent 30 years with the NYPD. He ascended to the rank of chief of department, which is the highest ranking uniformed officer, 4 stars. He was the chief of detectives. So when he was hired out in Suffolk County, the person who hired him, Steve Ballone, had 2 years left on his term. So I don't think that Rodney Harrison necessarily thought he would stay longer than 2 years. And I think that by him resigning or putting in his notice just before the election, he was letting the new county executive know, you do what you think is best.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little worried about who they pick. I hope they pick somebody who has an extensive investigative background, because as we can see, it was a big help in this case. So you're on the boots on the ground for Channel 11 for this Rex Heuermann thing. I mean, I don't think we see a trial for about a year, right? I mean, I don't think
because of all the discovery material. But I should point out that I covered the case almost from day one. I mean, when it happened late at night, and one of our reporters from the 10 o'clock news was on it when they found the first body on December 11th of 2010, and that was Melissa Barthelemy. And then a few months later, they found more bodies. And I got involved when they found Shannon Gilbert's belongings in December of 2011. And she was the one who sort of initiated the whole search to begin with, because she went missing and her family demanded answers. And so the dog was out looking for her on Ocean Parkway. And when they found the first woman, they thought it was Shannon, but it wasn't. And the next 3 weren't Shannon. So anyway, once I did the Shannon Gilbert case, the next year we had Superstorm Sandy, which decimated a lot of Long Island and parts of New Jersey and even New York City. So that took up a lot of our coverage. But I have to tell you, when I really got involved with the Gilgo Beach case was when John Bittrolff was arrested for 2 cold cases in the early 90s. He lived in Manorville. He was a carpenter. I knew that 2 of the Gilgo victims, that their torsos and some other body parts were found out in the woods of Manorville. So I was intrigued because I thought, could he be the elusive killer? So I started doing a lot of stories about Bittrolff and about the fact that we weren't finding this killer. And then over the years, I really did a lot more after 2014.
Before I'd like to get into a little bit of Bittrolff, because he was just was supposed to have a court appearance. But before we do that, because you were talking about you were actually when this whole thing was starting and they were finding bodies, just from the reporter standpoint, when all this news started coming out, what were you thinking? Like, What was the first thing as a body after body after body? What was going through your mind?
No, I mean, it was insane. But, the prominent part of the headline was focused on the fact that these young women advertised on Craigslist. They were escorts. And that was always in the headline. And Craigslist was something I wasn't that familiar with at that time. And it's been pointed out in recent months that maybe the MO of this alleged killer changed once he started hiring people online, through these services like Craigslist. Because if you believe, and we don't know, but if you believe that the same killer is responsible for the 10 sets of remains that were found on Ocean Parkway, you would have to believe that that person changed their MO of how they deposited or got rid of the bodies, because some of the victims were dismembered and some were intact. The Gilgo 4 were intact.
And as they keep on finding more and more bodies, what was, so you're probably hanging out with all the other reporters. What was like that conversation going on?
Well, aside from hanging out with the reporters and, speculating, you're also going to Oak Beach, which was where Shannon Gilbert first disappeared. And you want to know, what was going on at this party? Because it all started with a phone call. And the person who hired Shannon Gilbert came under a lot of scrutiny. And so did people that lived in that area. But then the Gilgo 4, they were hired in different ways. They were hired by someone who was using a burner phone. The person who hired Shannon Gilbert in Oak Beach did not use a burner phone, did not attempt to disguise his identity. So I was told, even before Rex Heuermann was arrested, that they did not believe that the person who hired Shannon Gilbert was involved, in the Gilgo Beach case. So even though a lot of people were running with the thought that it was someone on Oak Beach who did it, the original chief of detectives, Dominic Verone, said he did not believe it was someone associated with Oak Beach. He also didn't think it was the former Chief Burke, who got so much bad publicity, once he was accused and convicted of beating up a suspect who burglarized his police car.
Yeah, well, James Burke is the gift that keeps on giving, right? I mean, he keeps on returning back to the scene here, so to speak, in regards to putting his name out there. But when Richard Dormer, who was then the police commissioner, said that we might have a serial killer, I almost fell off the chair, because police departments generally don't use that term. I don't care how bad things look. They tend not to say serial killer because it causes a huge media storm.
And then, of course, there were some hearings about Gilgo, and some of the public officials pointed out that the women that were being targeted worked in the sex field. And so basically the officials were telling the public that it did not seem totally random. It seemed to be a select group of people that were being targeted. The families were upset because they felt the cases weren't being taken seriously because these women worked in the sex industry.
Yeah, no, so we had a comment here from Scott. He's saying, can you ask Mary how they decided who was going to run the investigations for LISK? And he said he was a go-between for someone who saw something suspicious, and the Suffolk County Police Department wouldn't respond, and he had to call the state police department. I don't know exactly when this happened.
What year was that happened?
Scott, if you're still in the room, if you have a year on that, it could be before the task force or after the task force, but that's been a complaint from the very beginning, right? About people who had reached out information, and kind of reason how John Ray got into this whole thing, and specifically taking affidavits because people don't want to come to the police because they don't trust them.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the problem here is that what I'm told is that the FBI did get involved in the first year of the investigation, sent up resources. The agents even trying to do a profile of who this killer could be. And then once the administration changed in the police department, and James Burke was actually selected as chief of department before the new police commissioner was selected, but that's very unusual. So once the regime change happened and you have all new people at the top of the police department, apparently Chief Burke didn't want the FBI nosing around in his territory. So many people had speculated, he must have something to hide with this case. But it might just be he had something to hide with other cases. Yeah. He was involved in a lot of stuff out there. And he probably didn't want the feds nosing around.
Yeah, so Scott did get back to us. He said it was around 2014 that they were pretty much that he had to act as a go-between because
Yeah, well,
Suffolk
that
just
makes
wasn't taking.
sense. That's
Yeah,
totally in the time frame. James Burke was appointed chief of department at the end of 2011, and then he was arrested in 2015. So there was that 4-year window when I don't think that much was happening with Gilgo.
yeah. It's and even after that, the two police commissioners afterwards, really not much going on. I mean, we did get the belt, right? The famous belt with the initials on it.
Well, just to be fair, like, well, Tim Sini came in and he had some affiliation with the FBI, but he also had worked, I think, as a federal prosecutor.
Yeah.
And so he apparently, I think I've read since the Heuermann arrest that he did get some FBI involvement. And then Geraldine Hart used to be very much at the top of the Long Island Bureau of the FBI, and she was brought in. And, then they were creating the Gilgo Beach website. And then the decision was made in the beginning of 2020, I believe it was right before the pandemic, to have this press conference where they held up a piece of the belt or showed a piece of the belt in a photo. And the initials were on there. I'm trying to remember the initials, if it was like HM or WH. Everyone was trying to figure out, who had initials like that, especially in the pool of potential suspects. But anyway, that the belt was the first thing we saw in years that had anything to do with evidence in the case. And Commissioner Hart at that time said, we believe the killer handled this belt. Right. And now we know, since the accused killer was arrested and the indictment was revealed, we know that that belt apparently was used to tie up Maureen Brainard-Barnes. She is the fourth of the Gilgo Four. And I think the district attorney, Ray Tierney, is close to making an announcement on what's going to happen with her case. When the indictment was announced against Rex Heuermann in July, we were surprised in court that he was only charged with 3 of the Gilgo 4 murders. And apparently it was because some of the scientific evidence in Maureen Brainard-Barnes' case needed more time. She was out in the elements for 3 years before she was found. She was the first of the Gilgo 4 to disappear. She disappeared in 2007. So I think that whatever evidence was there could have been a little bit more degraded. But it's interesting to note that the belts were around Maureen Brainard-Barnes. The other 3 women had the camouflage burlap tape tying them up. And that was another significant thing that came out. We all spent so many years thinking burlap from a landscaper tied up these women. And it turned out it was camouflage burlap, which is different. And it's something that hunters use.
So Lisa, why don't you make a prediction? Says we've been hearing close since July. How much longer do you think? I guess Maureen Brainard-Barnes gets added to the docket against Rex
All right.
Heuermann.
Well, I'm hearing around the holidays, and we're almost upon the holidays. So I'm hearing we're going to have some news within the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, I actually went out on a limb. I said I think we'll hear something after Commissioner Harrison leaves. I think that's when we're going to get some more information happening. But it's going to, let's put it this way. Watch those court appearances really closely in the district attorney's office, because he's going to hold a press conference for sure. So the people who are
every time I see, I get a lot of releases from Ray Tierney's office, and every time I see a release coming up, I'm like, oh, is it a press conference about this 4th victim? I know I'll have to get out to Riverhead, and that's at least 80 miles from Midtown, 70 or 80 miles. So I'm always worried every time I see a release. But he puts out a lot of releases about different cases.
And that's a trip. People who don't live in the area or know about it. I mean, to go from Manhattan all the way out to Suffolk County to do a press conference, boy, it could take you a couple of hours to get there. It depends on time. It could take you all day. It depends on what time you leave.
Yeah.
So as you're following now Rex into court, and the whole hoopla with Asa Ellerup, his former wife, in court, and the whole Peacock deal, what's the temperature about? Is there a lot of people outside waiting to get a glimpse of anybody that comes in?
There was in the beginning. I mean, the first time we were in court was July 14th, the afternoon after Rex Heuermann was arrested, and it was packed, the courtroom. And then I believe it was August 1st, another packed courtroom with some of the family members showing up with the DA's office. So that was August 1st. Then we had a hearing in September, also packed. That was the end of September. And then the most recent hearing was the first time it wasn't a full house. That was November 15th, right before Thanksgiving. And I would say it was only half full. But every time we go, we learn something new, and one of the first things we learned was that once Rex Heuermann's name was isolated as the owner of that avalanche, which has become sort of central to this case, once he was identified as the prime person of interest, that was in March of 2022. So that's more than a year and a half ago. When he was identified, they had all these cameras trained on his house to show his comings and goings over the year and a half before the indictment was announced. So every time we go, something new comes up.
Yeah, so I guess they put up a series of poll cameras and everything else to try to track.
I will say one other thing. Being there on the day the indictment was unsealed on July 14th this year, it was pretty incredible because the DA's office put out a 32-page affidavit on why he should not get any bail in this case and why he should be remanded and remain in jail until the trial happens. And so many details were in that affidavit, more than I've ever seen in my entire career. And I have covered a lot of criminal cases and trials. This was more than I ever saw. And what everyone who follows this case has sort of zeroed in on are the searches that he allegedly did on his internet, Rex Heuermann. He searched about John Bittrolff, another person who was sort of mentioned in connection with serial killings. He searched for a lot of information about this case. He searched for information about the families of the victims. He knew what they looked like. But the one piece of information people like me focused on was this search for male Asian twink. And that's because I looked it up. A twink is sort of a slang name used for an Asian man that may be effeminate in his appearance. And the Asian male who was still unidentified, he was wearing women's clothing and was slight. He was only maybe about 5'6", poor dental health, and was believed to have been dead for 5 to 10 years. So he was found in 2011, but he may have been dead for 10 years before that. So, when we saw that, a lot of us focused on, could this serial killer be bisexual? Could he be killing not just women, but men? And so a lot of us, did a little bit of research on that as well.
Yeah, that's one of the cases that we're looking for an identity for. We need to find out who he was because it's important from the investigative standpoint, and we have Peaches and her baby.
The toddler was intact. The little girl was not dismembered, but her mother was dismembered, and they were on opposite ends of Ocean Parkway. Peaches some of her extremities or her limbs were found on the Nassau County side of Ocean Parkway, and the little girl was on the other end, close to Valerie Mack, I believe, who was only identified in 2020 during the pandemic. Geraldine Hart made a taped announcement that we have finally identified this Jane Doe from the Gilgo case.
Yeah, no, and it's important because remember when Karen Vagata's information came out, and then everybody starts coming forward, and that's what we hope for, right? So when the identity of these individuals come out, that people come out and say, I know who this person was. I saw this person last. I mean, we know that the police, including the FBI, have been reaching out to people out in Mobile, Alabama for the identity of Peaches.
Yes.
And that was over. Yeah, October was a year that they made that accident, making the Facebook post. The Mobile, Alabama Police Department. Yeah,
yes.
they made a big boo boo there. But and we haven't really heard much about that in that respect. But it's important that we identify and give the victims back their names too.
Yes.
Now, from covering this court case, now, do you see any kind of strange happenings that you think might have any twists and turns? Just as a guess, like you think there's going to be any big news coming out in the next couple of months about this case, about Rex, or about any of the victims?
Well, the only big news that came out was when John Ray unexpectedly held a press conference. He's the lawyer who represents the family of Shannon Gilbert, and he held the press conference with the police commissioner at the time, Rodney Harrison. I mean, that usually doesn't happen. It was kind of shocking to us. The police commissioner actually drove over from his headquarters and appeared at the office of John Ray. And John Ray kind of made these stunning statements saying that Karen Vergata had been picked up by an off-duty detective from the NYPD who was a swinger, who had a friend, and they saw Karen Vergata in Manhattan, and then they drove out to Rex Heuermann's house. I mean, these are allegations. Certainly, the DA was not happy about this press conference, but John Ray said this woman was a credible witness, and he had a sworn statement from her. And, the woman alleged she and her boyfriend went out to Massapequa Park, and she believes that maybe her boyfriend got involved sexually with Rex and that Karen might have. She said that Karen came running out of the house naked when she and her boyfriend were leaving, and they decided to leave her there, according to this statement. And then there was another statement that a taxi driver, a female taxi driver, encountered Rex Heuermann out by a hotel on the LIE when she was picking up a fare. And she claims that it was Shannon Gilbert who was in the hotel and came out and was very upset. I mean, so when these things are stated, the DA would make an argument that it would be a detriment to the investigation, that it's not being vetted by people that are experienced in figuring out what works as testimony and what doesn't, what's credible. But anyway, that was sort of the biggest thing that happened since Rex was arrested.
Yeah, no, like I said, I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop. So we had some interesting news that could have been even more interesting with John Bittrolff, his name appearing on the docket for Suffolk County. His lawyers are now alleging that he didn't get all the evidence in the first case. I know you did some follow-up reporting on the initial story, right? Is that basically what we're hearing now?
I mean, everyone got into sort of a panic when they saw Bittrolff's name Friday morning at 8 a.m. He was supposed to be in court, or there was supposed to be hearing at 8 a.m. And I've covered the courts for 40 years, and I don't remember the last time that I went to an 8 a.m. hearing. Usually court opens at 9 o'clock or 9:30. So we thought that was odd. And we're like, well, is he being brought down from the Canadian border? I mean, he's in Clinton Correctional, and that's 30 miles from Canada, upstate New York. So I started doing some outreach. And, I did speak to the DA briefly, and he said, well, he's not LISK. He may have made that statement in the context of LISK and the 4 women that were first found. But I guess I was taking it like, well, he's not involved with the other cases. But, when you consider that the 2 women were found dismembered in Manorville, it makes you pause. However, you can look at something else here. The women that were found in Manorville connected to Gilgo, Valerie Mack and Jessica Taylor, they were not doing work locally. I believe that Jessica Taylor was last seen at the Port Authority in Manhattan, sort of close to Midtown. Rex Heuermann worked in that area, and he's not been charged in this case. But, she was hired, I believe, Jessica Taylor in Manhattan. And Valerie Mack, she used to do a lot of work in Pennsylvania, I think, Philadelphia, but she was last seen in Port Republic, New Jersey. And then she turned up dead. Part of her body was found out in Manorville a few months later. So John Bittrolff, the women that he was convicted of killing, well, there were 3 women, but he was convicted in 2 cases. They were not dismembered. They were posed in a sexual manner, and they all had their left shoe missing. So it almost seemed like a ritualistic type murder because of the positioning. So you just wonder if that's just a totally different MO from the victims connected to Gilgo.
Yeah, no, and then, like I said, I've been waiting to see if they release what they have in the search warrants, right? Because that's going to be a big story about not only Rex's house. Were you at the house when those search warrants were going on?
Yes, I was there. Well, the first day, there were 12 days of searches going on. The first day I was in Riverhead when the indictment was unsealed and when Rex was first brought into court. So that's where I had to be. We had another reporter, Henry Rosoff, at the house for the beginning of the searches. And then as it dragged on into day 11 and 12, after the weekend, when the second weekend, they dug up the backyard looking to see if there were potential remains. We were told they didn't find remains in the backyard. They used bulldozers and other devices. Day 11, the former police commissioner now, Ronnie Harrison, he came to the scene. And then the final day, day 12, Ray Tierney was there, the district attorney of Suffolk. So I was there for some of the search.
Yeah, no, and then the one thing that has piqued everyone's interest too, that at the storage facility where they asked for the medical examiner to respond, there is,
Yeah, I wondered about that. Did they find body parts there, or was that just protocol? Was the medical examiner there because it was all hands on deck? We don't really know. They've been
no,
very tight-lipped about what they found in these storage lockers, even in Rex's house, Rex Heuermann's house. Some people don't like when you just use the first name. I know that the day they started the search, the police commissioner said, we're going to look and see if there were trophies that he kept of his victims, alleged victims. So, but they've been very tight-lipped, and I think that's sort of a pattern that we've had since his name came up among law enforcement in March of 2022. That name was not leaked. Several people asked me when I was doing the live reporting on the first day, when the indictment was unsealed, did you ever hear the name Rex Heuermann? I never heard the name Rex Heuermann, but I did hear Massapequa Park because of the pings from the cell phones. So Massapequa was always in the mix for the last dozen years. And so was Midtown, because there were pings at Penn Station from a couple of victims' phones and also from the burner phones.
Yeah, no, it's actually amazing how they put all that stuff together. After so many years, they were able to put it together and pull out basically a rabbit out of a hat, so to speak. I mean, honestly, I never thought they were actually going to solve this case because it was just so badly handled from the beginning.
Well, I think it's a testament to the task force.
Yep.
We have to remember that this was a task force, a team. It wasn't about one person. I mean, the person who made the significant find that led to Rex Heuermann's name was a female state police investigator who was working in this database and found someone who had a first generation Chevy Avalanche registered in Massapequa Park. And so she put the name Rex Heuermann with that vehicle. So kudos to her. That's when he became a prime suspect.
Yep. And eventually when this is all over, hopefully she gets her accolades, because she's the one that really broke this case wide open, as far as, I mean, and, just from the cold case standpoint, I've always told people 9 times out of 10, the answers are in the case file. You just have to get that fresh set of eyes to look at it, and it's important. So let's switch gears once again. Let's talk about Mary Murphy Mysteries and your work. So we covered the show The Missing. Now you have another show, Mary Murphy Mysteries, and your cold case advocacy part, doing some older homicides. Just how did that show come about?
That actually, it's an episode or segment that's on Pix 11 News. And it was actually 10 years ago, in October of 2013, that I was asked to do 2 segments a week. And at that time, I received a cameraman that was working with me full time and an editor. And the first cold case I did was Jam Master Jay, who I believe he was killed in 2002. So that was a cold case. But since we started doing these mysteries, there have been federal indictments relating to 2 or 3 people that have been charged with the murder, including the alleged shooter. But so that was the first one I did. And then the day after I did my first mystery, they found the identity of Baby Hope and the alleged killer who was later convicted. That case, I think, was cold for 24 years, a really long time.
I worked on that case for a long time.
I was working at another station in the early 90s when this little girl's body was found in a cooler off the Henry Hudson Parkway in the woods. It was heartbreaking. They really weren't sure how old she was because she was very emaciated and had not been fed well. And I know that the cold case squad and the Manhattan North homicide detectives wanted this case solved. They had raised money to get a pretty dress for her, to give her a funeral and bury her with dignity. And they called her Baby Hope because they had hoped that they would get justice for her. And so when it came out that Baby Hope was identified, that was a huge development. And actually, Crime Stoppers played a role in solving the case, because around the anniversary of her discovery, they went to pretty close to where she was found in Upper Manhattan and were handing out flyers. And someone saw a news report about it and said she remembered a conversation in a laundromat where a woman was talking about she had a sister at one point, and the sister, when she was little, had been killed, and mentioned the fact that it was someone in the family who did it, like a cousin or something. So when the DNA was all matched up,
Yeah, no, I worked on that case a long time. And when I was in cold case, I couldn't tell you how many hours we sat in the cemetery just watching the gravestone from afar. We
Wow.
had pole cameras. We had it because, especially during the holidays, because we anticipated hopefully someone would show up. That was, unfortunately, a lot of people did show up in regards to not investigative leads, but people paying their respects. But it was not on the registry at the cemetery. Unless you knew where it was or you just stumbled upon it, you would have never found it.
Yeah.
And that was done for a reason. But
Well, Baby Hope was famous. That case was famous, but there were other cases that didn't get the same kind of attention that meant a lot to me when they were solved. There was a woman who lived in Brooklyn, and when she wrote to me, she was in her early 70s, and her daughter had been dead since 1980. She was a 19-year-old legal secretary working with the Brooklyn DA's office, and she was getting engaged and excited about it and wanted to have a little party at a place in Brooklyn in Flatbush, and had gone to put a deposit or to talk to the manager at the place about having the party. And apparently when she walked out to go home, her cousin's husband was there kind of watching her. And his side of the story is that he walked her part of the way home. It was raining out. But all we know, the facts are that a day and a half later, Lorraine Snell was found strangled with a cable in the back of a station wagon behind a supermarket where this cousin's husband used to work. So this man, James Burris, was always the prime suspect. But back in 1980, they checked his fingernails and whatever, and I guess they didn't find enough to charge him with anything. But on the same night, he robbed a cabbie or a cab stand. So he went to jail for robbery, got out and lived his life, actually became sort of a storefront minister. He lived behind a laundromat on Staten Island, and he used to hold services in sort of this garage. And so in 2014, when Miss Snell's mother wrote to me and I met her, I was very moved by her, a hardworking woman. She was a dietitian at one of the hospitals in Brooklyn. Her name, Pearl Snell Holder. And she came back with me to the scene where her daughter was found, very emotional. But she felt like people were just letting the case, or, detectives have so many cases. There are so many cold cases. She didn't want the case to die. She didn't want her daughter's case to languish in the system. So anyway, for the next 6 years, I kept up with the case. And really about a day before the city shut down in the pandemic, well, before that, the one thing I remember is that we found this minister in 2014. We found him at the garage where he lived on Staten Island. And I asked him every question under the sun about that. And when I first mentioned the name Lorraine Snell, he said, Lorraine, who? And then I said, your wife's cousin? Oh, yeah, my wife's cousin. And then he started talking up a storm about how they checked his fingernails up and down and they didn't find anything. And, when I asked him, well, you were the last person seen with her, he goes, well, I only walked her part of the way home. So fast forward 6 years, the pandemic is about to shut the city down. And on March 12th of 2020, the cold case detective, William Simon, arrested Bishop James Burris. He was a sort of self-described bishop. And he was arrested on Staten Island and brought to jail, and he's still there. There has not been a trial yet. But the mother has always been very grateful to us for publicizing her daughter's case. And that meant a lot to me when we went to the mom's stoop. And my cameraman was nervous about going in the house. He had just heard about this virus going around. And it quickly was becoming an emergency around the world. So we interviewed her outside on the stoop, and I showed her with my cell phone, James Burris in handcuffs. And she looked up at the sky and said, thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus. Lorraine has finally gotten her justice. It was 39 and a half years at that point, almost 40 years to the day of her daughter's death.
Yeah, that's a great story. And they use some of your interview with him?
Well, apparently, when we did the story in 2014, we already had the internet being used extensively. So we would sometimes put up these PIX extras, like extra things that didn't air because we don't air a 20-minute interview normally. But the full interview was on the web, so anyone could see it. And when the DA's office and the police saw it, they saw what they felt were inconsistencies in his original statement.
Yeah, so it's amazing to show you how, right? Somebody gets a news reporter gets that microphone into somebody's face. You never know how it's going to go.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great story. So Lorraine Snell. So you said it hasn't gone to trial yet?
It has not gone to trial yet, no. And the mom is now in her 80s, but she went to court when he was arraigned, and I know it meant the world to her.
Yeah, no. So we're gonna be putting that case on our docket, right? We're gonna be watching for that. I'm sure you'll keep us posted in regards to that. So any other big cases you're working on in the future?
No, we keep up with the missing cases. And there was a woman from Wheaton, Illinois. She has schizophrenia, and she went missing in August, and she contacted her mother at the end of August on the phone. And then the mother kept trying to call her, and it turned out that the phone was ringing and ringing. And then finally someone answered it, a woman, and said, "Oh, I found it at the train station in the Bronx." So the young woman apparently had hitchhiked from Illinois to the Bronx. In between, the Pennsylvania State Police had called the mother and said, "Well, we saw her on the highway, but we dropped her off at a gas station." So it turned out that 3 months, or just a little over 3 months after she went missing, there was an off-duty officer, I think, doing security at an Apple store in Midtown Manhattan. And he noticed this woman who was there in the middle of the night using the computer, and she had a hood on. And then he apparently noticed the large rose tattoo on her forearm. And that looked really familiar, because that tattoo is included in all the notifications going to the police precincts in the city. So he made a call, and it was this woman, Shamari, was found. She was only 22 years old. She is only 22 years old. And, her family was thrilled, and they flew in, and they were reunited. But there you go, the power of social media and of the television. The story gets out there, and someone recognizes this big tattoo that was publicized.
No, it's absolutely amazing, right? When you think about it, and people, and it's about getting these cases out there, and you've been a huge advocate for that. We just got a whole bunch of new people just jumped in at the last couple of minutes here. We're with Mary Murphy, WPIX 11, New York City. News legend. We're gonna call you a news legend because you've been
like this
40
when you've been doing it for 40 years. Yeah.
Yeah, we can call you a legend, and it sticks, right? So. So you have two shows, The Missing and Mary Murphy's Mysteries. They're all included in the show notes, as well as Mary's Facebook page that you can go and visit. Is there a case that you'd like to see? Maybe not so much a New York case, but as the last couple minutes that we have, is there a cold case that you want to see closed, that you would like to see closed?
Oh boy, now you're really stumping me, because I have so many. Yeah, I did a missing case on this young guy. He was only 13 or 14, Eddie Tillman, and he had sisters and his mom, and they all were interviewed by me. And, he went missing over 16 years ago, and he's never been found. He had told his mother he was gay, that he liked boys. And, it's unclear if he might be in the transgender community now, because someone reported seeing him a few months after he disappeared, or a few years after, wearing women's clothing. So, I always wondered what happened to him, but there are so many cases I'd love to see closed out. My biggest satisfaction as a reporter was when I reunited a mother and daughter after 38 years. It was born out of criminality that this woman escaped from this crazy house in Brooklyn, where she was living with a lot of other women, and they were forced to beg in the subways. And some of them, I think, had been sex workers at night. But anyway, the woman got beaten up and fled the house, and her little girl was there, and she was only 2 years old or so at the time. She only knew that her name was Millie. She didn't know her birth date. And another woman in the house got the little girl out of that place and was raised with this woman's family. And so when I met the woman that didn't know who her mother was, she was calling herself Melandia Holt. Holt was the name of the woman who helped her and took her in. And Melandia was sort of a version of the name Millie. And Millie had gotten married, and she had 2 daughters. Anyway, we did this story and it was very emotional. She said, I believe that I lived in that house and I want to know who my mother is. I want to know who I am. And almost a year later, and I know the date because it showed up in my bio, on January 25th of 2015, I was in an airport in Tampa, Florida. And it was during a phase in my career when things weren't going as well as I would have liked. You know, we have all different management teams that come through. And so I wasn't on the 10 o'clock news at that time. I was working on the earlier shows. And I got this email at the airport and the woman said, I think that's my daughter. I just saw your story online. And so I got in touch with the woman in Pennsylvania. She was living near the Poconos and she was really nervous about meeting her, but she goes, I know that's my daughter. I know. And you could see in some of the facial structure that around the mouth area that they looked similar. Millie is biracial. Her mom is white and her dad was black. So anyway, and then I went to Millie to inform her that I had some news, and we called up the woman, and the woman on the phone said, you're my daughter. And Millie got very emotional, but we wanted them to meet. So a week later, I drove to Pennsylvania by myself and I picked up the woman, Lucy, and we drove her to Brooklyn, and they just fell into each other's arms and they were sobbing. But the mother said, I know you're my daughter and here's your birth certificate. And she had been born in August of 1975 and she was turning 40 the year that this reunion took place. Millie was. And so we did go to a DNA place and it was a match. So
Wow.
that story really meant a lot to me. And so Millie was in touch with her mother for 6 years. She found out she had a half sister that she's still in touch with, half brother. And then sadly, I think within the last year, Lucy died and Millie informed me. And it just, watching that whole reunion, seeing the connection again, having a woman find out her name and who she was and where she was born meant a lot to me.
Well, that's a fantastic story and a good note to land on. It's got to make you feel good, all your work that you've done, Mary.
Yeah. I feel grateful because, my father was a bus driver. My mother worked as a waitress and she was a stay-at-home mom for most of our young years. And, we really didn't come from very much, but I feel like it's been such a privilege to really report on so much in my hometown over the last 40 years and to witness so much history. I reported on both World Trade Center attacks. I was there when President Obama put the wreath at Ground Zero after Osama bin Laden was killed by the Navy SEALs. So much history, the pandemic, Superstorm Sandy. It's been a real honor to be able to tell these stories, the stories that most people didn't know about. And then, of course, the big ones that we hear about through the course of history.
Well, just on the ending note, so Flynn Brown from Finland there, Mary, your impact reaches way beyond your hometown.
Oh, thank you. You got someone from Finland online. That's wonderful.
Well, yeah, we have another number of countries. Actually, I had one of our viewers correct me one time because I had mentioned just the United States, and she's like, "I live in Australia, so it is an international audience." So
well,
we have.
I got the sunlight now, coming through the blind, so I got a stripe across my face. But you mentioned the Leandra Guzman. She is the mother of Junior, who was killed by gang members in 2018. And, I got a tip from someone in Paterson, New Jersey, that the 4 people wanted for the actual stabbing were hiding out in a safe house there. And I reported that from my dining room table on Facebook. And within an hour, 100,000 people were watching my report. So the Junior case went around the world. It really, really touched people. This kid was, a victim of mistaken identity, according to the police. And he was walking home. He was out about 11:30 at night, and 4 cars came by, and they were from the Trinitarius gang seeking a rival from another set of the gang. And they started chasing Junior, and they chased him into a deli, a bodega, and he tried clinging to the counter behind the actual main counter, and they pulled him out, and then he was killed outside. So people from South Africa, Australia, Amsterdam wrote to me on that case.
Yeah, everyone's putting in their countries. I can't even keep track of all of them that are watching this all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
that's the Grizzly crew came in here. Boy, we went from 150 to 200 people like in a matter of minutes. So I wanted to say thank you to Gisela and all the Grizzlies out there that came in. So, Mary, it was a pleasure speaking with you again. Keep on doing what you're doing. I think that, there's very few reporters that have the skills that you have, those people skills. And I think that's what makes you so successful at doing this.
Thank you. It was great to chat with you for the last hour.
Yep. Thanks for coming on, Mary. So, everybody, I'd like to make sure, Mary, you have a great holiday season. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. We'll be in touch, I'm sure, on some other notes. Thank you, Teresa, for that last minute gift. Thank you very much. So, Mary, I want to wish you all the best in the future and continue doing your work and success. And everybody, have a great day. Thanks for watching and have a safe day. Bye, guys.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Weeks.